Welcome to the C Word, the Conservators podcast. Today we're talking about dyes. I'm Jenny Mathiasson, an objects conservator based in Carmarthenshire.
And I'm Kloe Rumsey, an objects conservator based in Greater Manchester.
Welcome to the show, everyone.
Hello.
Today we're talking about dyes, and we've got a special guest host with us. Would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners?
Hello, I'm Alison Lister. I'm a textile conservator. I run my own business, Textile Conservation Limited, based in Bristol.
I was sort of thinking that we might unpick sort of what our experiences are around using dyes in conservation. It's a big topic. You guys work a lot more with textiles than I do, so maybe I'll start by being the baby of the group here. In that, I'm a general objects conservator. I work more with textiles than I think I thought I would, because there's a lot of costumes and textiles feature in a lot of things. When I say my experiences with dyes, they're quite limited. Up until a couple of years ago, pretty much the only thing I'd done in terms of dyeing anything was getting some off-the-shelf dye, like the stuff you use for your clothes. Because I've dyed my own clothes before, that's fine. But that's a very different game than using something in conservation. But I got some off-the-shelf dye to dye cotton tape to look brown so that it would blend in with something. But that wasn't in use with an object. It was part of set dressing, and it was just because they needed a sort of a material that I had on hand, and it was cotton tape, and there you go, and I just made it look brown. So I had zero experience with this up until last year when I had this little project that I was oh, I'm gonna need to dye something. Oh God, what have I done?
Oh no,
I don't have that much experience with this sort of thing, but I know that you guys do, so do tell me about that.
So Jenny, I remember you messaged me quite a lot during that project, and the essence of the messages were, "What the is going on?"
I think my actual feelings towards trying to read anything about sort of dyes used in conservation was, is this actual witchcraft? What is this? And that's sort of still how I feel.
Yeah, so I think that So I'm obviously, for people that don't know, objects conservator started in textiles, and then from my work in a textiles conservation studio, that's when I learned to use dyes, and I'd seen it done and thought, okay, and then I learned how to do it. And I really felt for you when I got your messages, because I was thinking about myself before I learned it and whilst I was learning, and I thought there really is this barrier the barrier of how to do it, how to even approach it. So my use of dyes is, I suppose, the standard textiles conservation use of dyes. Fill fabrics, support fabrics. I've dyed nylon net and silk. I've never dyed polyester. My colleague has, and it looked like witchcraft, even though it was a really similar process. But she was using a different type of dye, and there were, the health and safety warnings on it were, much more than Lanacet, which is what I use for silk. And it just seemed like a kind of big deal. So that's my gap in knowledge of the different types of dyes. I've been using dyes for 3 years. That's it. But I now approach dyes with I'm quite excited to do it now, because I love colour matching. I know. But I would say I feel very lucky to be in a studio that has been dyeing fabrics for 30 years. So they've got folders and folders of dye recipes and little fabric swatches, and this is how we got to this colour.
Wow.
And so I think if I didn't have that, I'd be at sea. But I'm interested to see what Alison thinks of her place in dye use and everything we've said.
Well, Jenny, if you're the baby and Kloe, you're the teenager, I think that must make me the sort of pensioner grandmother. So I'll tell you what my experience of dyeing is. I trained as a textile conservator at the Textile Conservation Centre, which was at Hampton Court in those days, in the late 1980s. So I probably did the dye course, which was an element of that program, in 1989. I was trying to work out when that might have been. And what we did then, it was a week-long course. where we were introduced to the whole process of dyeing, the theory behind the colouring of fabrics, the different categories of dyes and where they came from and how they were applied to the fabrics. And then actually did a series of practical sessions where we created little triangles to show how if you combine 2 or 3 colours in different ways, you get different shades. And I still have my triangle and a set of sheets to show how you change the depth of shade by varying the calculation. And I still have those as well. We also shared between our little group the samples that other people had done. So actually by the end of the dye course, we all came away with our own little starter kit of dyes. And also a copy of the TCC dye manual, which is still around and is still given out to textile conservation students in a slightly modified form since the course went to the University of Glasgow. And I have several updated versions that have come from students and interns and employees that I've had at the studio over the years. So I've actually got a bit of a library of dye manuals. And I noticed looking at the very earliest one that actually the original dye manual was first created from some research done in 1980 by someone called Colleen Wilson. And then over the years, it was updated by both the sort of lecturers and the conservation practitioners and the conservation scientists at the TCC over the years, sort of gradually adding more information, refining the instructions. And I mean, now I think it's a 40-page document or something like that. And I suspect most textile conservators in the UK and possibly even worldwide still have the manual as the kind of core of the data they use in dyeing. And I certainly use my version of the manual when I do dyeing. So first thing to say is that after kind of 30 years of dyeing fabrics, I still need to get the manual out.
Oh, that's helpful.
And I don't feel any shame in doing that. So I'm happy to kind of whip that out in front of the students saying, I always need to check the dye manual. But I do think just over the years, I am sort of familiar with the process, more confident in the process, perhaps more willing to critique when things have gone wrong without thinking I've just sort of failed, I'm hopeless at dyeing, but to actually try to investigate what might have gone wrong and to understand how I can do it better. I think it's just an ongoing process of developing and learning and gaining confidence and trying things.
That's wonderful to hear that you're still using that manual. That's somehow so helpful.
It really is. And I think it makes me think of the fact that this is so specialism-led. We're trained objects conservators, not really had an opportunity to try dyes, but every textile conservator trainee has done the training, at least some of the training. And I suppose is that because it's so kind of niche and time consuming and materials consuming that in order to learn it, you've got to learn it a lot rather than learn it a bit. Does that make sense? You've got to go kind of deep dive into it in order to understand. And if you do it partially, you'll just come away going, no, I've got nothing.
That is definitely how I felt.
I do think it's because, good colour matching is really key to the success of the treatments that we apply, because so much of our support treatments, as we call, are about applying a new fabric to an original fabric in a way that is not obtrusive or disruptive or disfiguring or distracting in any way. So colour matching is such a key element, I think, of the success of our work. And personally, I see dyeing as this 2-part process. The first bit is the colour matching, which is about choosing the right shade for the object, bearing in mind the qualities of the material that you're attaching and the way that you are attaching that material, whether it's going over the top or going behind, whether you're going to see a large bit of this new backing or just a small part. And I think, to me, that artistry element. And then there's the actual technical process, as we've described in the manual, which is it's following calculations. And that's all about precision and accuracy. And actually, the colour matching is the really important skill and judgment that I feel a textile conservator needs to develop. And there isn't a manual for that. But that is what you really learn over years of practice. And if you get it right, then you know that the quality of your conservation work, your support treatment will be the best it can be.
My parents are artists. My mum taught me to paint. Colour mixing in paint, I absolutely love. And I feel that I have quite a good eye for colour matching. So when I was learning, I was thinking, yeah, I'm going to use this because this is like this. I'm going to try these ones because this is sort of similar, and blah, 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 blah. Looking at the samples, loving every minute of colour matching. And then I'd get to the calculations as a dyslexic person who can hardly count at the best of times. And it brought me to tears because I just, as soon as you stick a number on it, didn't understand. It took me weeks. And then I had to relearn it the next time I did it, and then relearn it again the next time I did it, because it's just the numbers thing. If it was sticking dyes in some water and going, yes, that's the right colour visually, I could do it. But then there's no repeatability there at all.
People used to do it that way. They used to do it by eye, a drop here and a dash there. And there's the right colour. And maybe some conservators still do. I think the reason we now have a manual and we have a series of formula is that we want to be able to reproduce these colours, which is all about efficiency, isn't it? To be able to find a colour and make it yourself, when you need it. And that's where all the formula come in. But what I would say is that I think it doesn't matter. Obviously, it must be painful for you to have to go through that process every time. But it doesn't matter that bit of the process you have to write down step by step in order just to remember the formula and the process. Because to me, that is a technical thing, and you can just follow instructions. What really, really matters is your eye for colour and your ability to match to colours. And I think we say colour matching, but one of the difficulties we have with historic textiles is that they are no longer a single colour. Even just one red is never just a single red now, because they've become aged, they've faded, they've got spots and stains all over them. So what are we actually matching to, first of all? Which bit, where? So I think it's fine to have the whatever level of instruction you need to work out how much dye powder to mix with how much water. And then what really you need to be developing as a professional conservator is that colour matching skill.
I love that we're talking about this, because much like Kloe, I'm so accustomed to doing this with like paints or something similar, and even then what I do is crude compared to what paintings conservators do, for goodness sake. But I do a decent job, and I love playing with colours. I foolishly thought, how different can it be when it's dyes? Turns out that was a challenge level I was not prepared for, because as you say, like we're not sort of colour matching something that's like a straightforward colour.
No.
So to describe the problem I was having was that it was a piece of costume that I was challenged with. The outside was silk. There was a pattern to begin with, quite a straightforward pattern in some ways, of leaves and vines in a kind of cream colour on what was now a greeny, browny, yellowy, sort of strange, dirty backdrop. But it was a dirty looking type of colour. Now, I know how to do that with paints, but with dyes, and it just broke my head. Thoroughly, it just broke me. But some of the problems here was that I didn't really have any of the sort of equipment. I didn't have any literature on hand at all that was useful, so I was sort of reliant on internet searches for this sort of thing, and Chloe's encouraging words. I didn't really have a lot of experience, and I didn't have a lot of budget to like go and suddenly try out dye systems. And in the end, I didn't dye anything at all because I just couldn't get the color right.
On that note, Jenny, I've just used paints to color small patches of things, and that's got a whole bucket of problems as well. If you're using washes, but
that was the compromise that I essentially settled on, was to use paints instead.
So have you used paints and things to solve a similar kind of problem, Alison? Or is that something that, because you now are so used to using dyes, it's much easier to just use dyes?
I do use different colorants because even after all of these years of dyeing, there are still instances on a regular basis where I just cannot get the right color. Or going through that entire process of dyeing for a tiny piece of fabric is not an efficient use of my time. And actually, if that is the case, then it may be a lot quicker and simpler and more efficient and in terms of the success of the color, to use paints. Actually, what I use are silkscreen pigments.
Ooh.
And they are designed for use with fabrics, and you get a binder, an acrylic binder, and a little set of liquid pigments, extremely strong. So you mix like paint to get the shade that you want. You mix in the binder, and then you can dilute it if you want a more sort of lightweight, loose kind of surface wash effect on your fabric. And you paint it on, you leave it to dry. To fix it, it needs to be hot ironed. And then I tend to hot wash afterwards and hot iron again, just to be absolutely sure. It gives you sort of flexibility in terms of the matching the colours. So that is something I would use an alternative to dyeing. I've also been looking at using pencils as a colouring material in a slightly different way. And I looked at a whole range of pencils for infilling. And I think they too have potential. And certainly if you're only doing a very small area, they can be very much easier and quicker to use.
On the note of describing how things are done, for people, I just want to go really back to basics and describe the process of dyeing that we're talking about, because I feel that maybe if someone hasn't even if conservators haven't even seen the process of dyeing, then they know there's a hot plate and they know that there's some powder. But if they're anything like me, that's all I had when I started. So it's essentially you get dyes of different concentrations, obviously in the same way as adhesives, with different amounts of powder and the correct amount of water. Then you mix ratios of those for colours, just like you do with paints, into a dye solution to get your right colour. The additives is something that blew my mind, of dye fastness and things like that.
Dye fastness is an important one, and certainly light fastness is one of the things that the additives really make the difference of. Wet fastness is not so much of an issue, I think, mostly because we're not normally going to be washing a supported textile afterwards. But the additives
ideally not.
The additives also help with levelling and the sort of take up of the dye, so that you get an even colour over your whole fabric. And in fact, levelling is a very difficult thing to achieve, because with the equipment that we tend to have, because it's fairly low tech.
So yeah, those additives are essentially different chemicals at different concentrations that you add into your solution. You mix everything in water with and a correct amount of water in with your piece of fabric that you're dyeing, and then you heat it up to different levels for different lengths of time, a little bit like potion making in Harry Potter. And that is it. So if you're boiling something on a stove, essentially, for different lengths of time and at different temperatures. Boiling is probably the wrong word, because these sort of specific temperatures are like heat up to 80 degrees for 30 minutes, that sort of thing.
Those temperature sort of shifts are to do with encouraging the dye to go into the fabric when you want it to go in an even way. If it all sort of rushed in, if you went straight to the high temperature, it would all sort of rush onto the fabric in a blotchy way. So controlling the temperature process is all about leveling, getting even dyeing.
There are occasional patchinesses in some of the things that I'm dyeing, and I think that's possibly, if the hot plate takes ages to heat up, or the pot that you've got on it on, that's another thing we can talk about, the actual physical equipment. If the pot you're using, if you're not using bain-marie, is that the right term, then if that's not perfectly flush to the hot plate, it might heat up slower.
There are so many variables involved in dyeing, which can mean you don't get the right colour, or you don't get an even colour, you don't get a dark enough colour. And unfortunately, I think because we're not using highly sophisticated equipment, which is what these dyes are developed for use with, that inevitably we are not going to get those really high quality, high standard levels of dyeing. And most of the time, that's okay. It's not going to show, it's not going to undermine your conservation work in any way. I think we should be striving for as high a quality as we can achieve, but we have to be realistic given the resources that we have available and the fact that we are not dyeing technicians. And the second thing I would say is that there are things that you can do if you have a problem with uneven dyeing, then maybe you need to look at something in the preparation of the fabric beforehand. Perhaps it has some finish on it that needs to be removed before dyeing, or yes, maybe your equipment doesn't control the temperature as evenly as it should. Perhaps you haven't got enough liquid in the whole dye pot for the fabric to move around and therefore to come into contact with all the dye molecules. So, there may be some very simple things that can be done, but also it could just be we just don't have the resources to create perfect dyeing, and perhaps 90% of the time that doesn't matter.
I really love it when things in conservation come down to, we can try our best, but at the end of the day, it's going to be fine. I feel like that's a really nice kind of down-to-earth conclusion that we can come to. And I think my concern when I'm dyeing is the fact, is this going to be light fast? Is this going to be wash fast? I've never done a bulk dye that has come out the wrong colour. And admittedly, I've only done it a few times, really. I feel like I've jinxed myself now. Oh, no.
Impressive, really impressive if you've never done a bulk dye that's come out the wrong colour, because it's the bulk dye is when everything can go.
Yeah, I was going to say.
You have a beautiful sample and it's all even, and then you do the bulk dye and it's a different colour and it's all blotchy. So you're getting it right in the right place.
Yeah, that's it. There's always the doubt, though, isn't there? Of, oh God, what have I done? And then it's always darker before it dries properly, and so you leave it for the weekend and you're upset all weekend, and then you come back and it's actually fine. So I spoke to Laura Peters the other day about the technical use of dyes and the sort of nitty-gritty, and particularly her work looking at different types of dyes and getting comfortable with dyes with students at Cologne University. Hello, I'm speaking to Laura Peters today to get a bit scientific with the conservation use of dyes. Would you like to introduce yourself, please, and your work?
Yeah, hi Kloe. Thank you for having me.
Hello.
And momentarily I work as a lecturer at the Institute for Conservation Sciences at the University of Applied Sciences Cologne, where I'm working in the textiles conservation department. We have 5 different disciplines and workshops here: the textile conservation, paintings and sculptures, wood and modern materials, stone and wall paintings, and the paper conservation department. And that gives a great exchange of knowledge and experience where we can interchange and learn from each other. And this is really great. I studied there myself and finished with my master's degree. Then for some years I worked at the Germanisches Nationalmuseum in Nürnberg, afterwards as a freelance conservator, and at the Ethnological Museum in Cologne. And now I'm back at the university, but now on the other side. And I'm mainly teaching the basics of practical textile conservation, including the use of dyes.
So your interest in dyes started while you were working as a textile conservator, didn't it? Can you tell us what made you want to study them in more scientific detail?
In textile conservation, the process of dyeing is used basically for the method of a patched or local or entire support for a damaged fabric. Support means a new fabric that matches not only in the structure of the weave and the material of the original, but also in its color, like a retouching. And this makes it nearly impossible to just buy the already perfect fabric. And moreover, sometimes you need 5 slightly different shades for just one object. So a new undyed and untreated fabric has to be dyed in the matching color, and through sewing work or the use of adhesives is connected to the original fabric. Unfortunately, the process of dyeing is a very time-consuming way to retouch, but therefore also very stable. Because the requirements for a proper dyeing for the use in textile conservation are especially high wet or wash and light fastness. And depending on your laboratory equipment, only one set of a dyeing process normally takes up to 2 to 3 hours, in which you can handle up to 8 different samples of different coloration. And if you're lucky, one of these samples fits the original, so you can carry out the final dyeing process. And as always, the more experience that you have, the better. because the process takes quite a long time, you want to achieve the highest reproducibility as possible. That's why almost all textile conservators use synthetic dyes and not natural ones. And depending on the substrate, like protein or cellulose fibers, you have different specification, like reactive, metal complex, and acid dyes. And since I'm working as a lecturer, it's more important than ever that I reconsider the content and techniques I teach. And there is always the potential of tunnel vision if you teach it for years and years to come. So this also came up in 2019 during a discussion at the Conservation in Colour Symposium of the Icon Textile Group in Manchester, where somebody asked why most textile conservators, at least in the UK, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and so on, use the same dyeing systems from only one producer. And the answer is because you use the ones you be taught where you have studied.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And on one hand, it's very reassuring because we have a lot of long time experience. But on the other hand, we might limit ourselves here. So after years of teaching only these very few specific dyeing systems, we wanted to rethink the whole subject.
So how have you studied these dyes and what have you found out?
At first, I took a closer look at the different components of the whole process of dyeing and made myself more comfortable with the whole chemistry behind them. Then I took a look at the different application methods of dyeing, and this is the most interesting part because these processes are often very sensitive to errors. Depending on the specification of the dye, the application methods are the exhaust dyeing or direct application with so-called pet steam or pet dry thermofix method. Usually performed is the exhaust dyeing method because it achieves the most evenly dye. The key challenge to achieve a properly dyed fabric is to perform the dyeing process as accurate as possible. And the chief difficulty here lies in the equipment used in the industry is not easily transferable in a commonly provided conservation workshop, and the dyes are made for the industry, so it's tricky. And only very few big museums can afford the automates from the industry, like a bigger dyer, because, of course, they are very expensive. And the amount of the fabric we dye is, of course, much less than the industry. So with an ordinary laboratory equipment, it's not easy to match the correct guidelines, like reaching the recommended dye solution ratio and bath ratio, observe and keep the time, hold and keep the correct temperature, use the right additives, execute the correct washing process, and so on. And any deviation leads to lower results concerning the wet and light fastness and the reproducibility. To adapt the standards of the industry for our workplace, we contacted the producer who supported us and helped us a lot. So we were able to make at least some adjustments. And then we started to run tests with some other dyeing systems with a simpler and therewith faster process, which worked quite fine in the first one. Then we did some more tests with the classical or known dyeing systems with intentional irregularities during the exhaust dyeing to see the impact, which wasn't as expected. Yeah, but the final and most interesting tests are still pending because we haven't yet tested the exact level of the reached fastness of the results. And that's might be the most important thing. We could and should do a lot more tests. There are a lot of unanswered questions of research yet, and I think we should think more out of the box and cooperate more with actual dyers.
Watch this space as well then. Well, that's exciting.
But it will take some time.
Well, we'll all be looking forward to that, I'm sure. So has your study changed the way that you use and select dyes in your work then?
I'm more open-minded, or try to be, and I'm always on the lookout for alternatives. I think I'm less frightened to use dyes in general, and I try to get to the bottom of the active principles, and I use them with more appreciation for another craft, definitely. After talking to the producer of these dyeing systems we use, it's really, the process is fascinating, and the craft is fascinating.
Would you be able to name some of the dyes that you've worked with most successfully for the listeners?
Yes, right now we decided to teach the dyeing systems from the Huntsman Corporation. It's Lanacet for protein fibers and Avitera for cellulose fibers.
And finally, what would you say to conservators who are nervous about starting to use dyes or to start using dyes in different ways?
As I'm just starting to use more or different dyes myself, I can also address myself here. But I think it's the same with any other topic of restoration or conservation that's new to us. And I mean, that's also one of the best parts of our job, that we are never fully trained. So we always have to adapt to new methods from time to time. And so, yeah, just take it as a very colorful new challenge. And if somebody's out there who has found an easy way to perform a good dye, please contact me.
Lovely answer. And I love that phrase, never fully trained. We are never fully trained. That's a really nice way of putting it. Well, thank you so much, Laura, for sharing your work with us. That was really interesting. And I'm sure if anyone has any further questions for you, you can contact the C Word and we can get in touch with Laura for you, or you can contact Laura directly if that's all right. Is that all right?
Yes, please. Of course.
Oh, that's a really lovely interview. I'd just like to say that I really appreciate that she also talks about how time-consuming dyes are.
I think it's one of those processes, though, that it's difficult for people outside of conservation to know where the time goes. So when I list dyeing on almost on my proposals, my quotes that I give out to clients, you know, they're thinking of what they do at home, which is they tip the powder into the washing machine, put in a couple of kilos of salt and press start and come back and it's dyed, and don't quite understand where is this 3 hours going? What's that being used for?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's obviously we were talking about the sort of the fear of using dyes and the fear of experimenting with different dyes. For me, because my understanding of the use of Lanacet is so new, if someone presented me with a new dye system and the instructions, I'd go, okay, well, I have the basics of Lanacet and I will probably understand this just as much. So I'll have a go.
That's one of the reasons, I think, why many of us stick with the dyes that we were first introduced to when we learned dyeing. And certainly in my studio, I use Lanacet for silk and wool and nylon, and I use solophenol for cotton and linen. And also, I think we have all the processes, we have the equipment, and we have all the free samples that we got years ago that we need, and there's not so much incentive to change. On the other hand, I do think it is very important that we are sort of constantly reviewing our methods and choices of materials and constantly seeking better alternatives that give us better quality of results. So yeah, I really applaud the work that Laura's been doing into Avitera, and I'm certainly very interested in exploring that dye if and when I get the chance to do so.
Yeah, I really want to have a go.
I think it is interesting because we conservators are often creatures of habit, and sometimes it's not just that we're familiar with something. Sometimes it's that it's something we've got. It's something that it will be expensive to change or experiment with, and sometimes those are real limiting factors that might mean that only like bigger institutions or universities get to sort of have a go at these other systems. So it's interesting that there may be more barriers here than just sort of knowledge and comfort.
Yeah, definitely. And this one of the reasons why I'm really keen to hear more about Laura's work when she's done the other tests is, yes, please tell me all the things about using that dye and I will just kind of nod and follow your instructions. If it comes, when it comes that we, either need to buy new dyes and fancy a change or fancy an experiment, or the situation comes at us that we need to use something different for whatever reason.
Just going back to the point you were making about changing systems, in some ways, actually, it would not be that difficult for me to change the system I use for dyeing, because essentially I have a very simple kit in the studio for the dyeing. So I have a balance, obviously, for measuring the powders, and I have measuring equipment such as pipettes and cylinders and glassware. And then I have a hot plate, which I bought from IKEA, and I use as my bain-marie an old paella pan, because it's sort of a wide, flat dish with handles. And I put little metal pots in that. It works a treat because it's sort of nice and stable. It's sort of wide, flat pan, really good. And for the bulk dyeing, I use a Burko, which is what people make tea in, at WI meetings and that kind of thing. And we've had that one for years, and it all works. But none of it is particularly expensive or difficult to get hold of. So I think if I did have to change, it wouldn't be a massive outlay. It's probably just effort that I need to put in.
Do you guys have any thoughts about like natural versus synthetic dyes? Have either one of you played with like natural dyes? Because I'm going to guess that both of your preferred systems are synthetic dyes, right?
I've never done natural dyeing. My partner Tom, he used to do natural dyeing with his mum, and from what he says, there's a lot of urine involved, and I'm just not really up for it. I think that's probably only one method and one colour, but I'm just like, oh, you know what?
Urine is not really a conservation grade material, is it?
No. Exactly.
I haven't used natural dyes either. So my background is actually in fine art. I trained in painting. So the sort of colour mixing method that Kloe was describing is very much how I view dyeing.
Yeah.
But I know that people have been looking into using natural dyes. In fact, at that colour conference that we talked about earlier, there was a paper specifically about natural dyes. And so I don't think it should be forever ruled out. What I was told when I learned about dyeing was that it's extremely difficult to reproduce the same colour, over and over, which is what we need, which is one of the criteria for choosing the dyes that we have now.
Yeah.
But from what I remember of that talk, there are ways of doing that. But my lasting memory of the conclusions was that a lot more time is needed to do natural dyeing than you need for synthetic dyeing.
Okay.
And that may well be, the impediment as far as I'm concerned. But it's definitely come back as a method that could be applied in conservation.
Anyway, I just thought I'd pick your brains about it because I was curious. I'd read a couple of articles about like natural dyes and stuff, but more I guess the pitch sort of was that it should be a contender, not that it's the preferred way or anything. But, I was just curious.
Is it more sustainable? Are there some good solid reasons why this is something we should really consider?
I mean, the article I was reading was sort of about colour matching to archaeological textiles, in which case it was sort of easier to get the right sort of muddiness.
Sympathetic, yeah.
Yeah, so it was sort of quite specific in that sense.
No experience, but the paper that was given at the colour conference, I think, made a very convincing case for us looking again at natural dyes. And I think certainly it appeared that you could get the colour that you were aiming for. I don't know how well someone else could then reproduce that colour, but certainly from what was said, I thought that a convincing case was being made for us looking again at natural dyes.
If someone said to me, this is going to be much more kind of ethical and sympathetic, I'd go, all right, yeah, I'll spend the time on it because I'm really interested in that side of things. But if it was, do you want to use this or do you want to use the thing that you've used before and you know that works and you can rely on it? I'd probably be a bit of a wimp.
Quite a few of our clients, particularly the private clients, ask us if we dye with natural dyes.
Oh.
So it's interesting that it's perceived by some clients, whether they're in the museum or outside of the museum, that we might try to reproduce the colours using the original dyes that were used on the actual object. So yes, that's quite a common question for us. The other thing that I think the natural dye other issue it raises is about what effect they have on the environment. So relates to how we dispose of these materials after we've used them. And I was always taught about, tipping it down the sink and flushing with lots of water. And that's about all the instruction that I got in terms of disposal.
Yeah,
that's true for a lot of chemicals.
It really is.
Perhaps there ought to be more investigation of that, and that may well be the thing that concerns us, the disposal of the dyes after dyeing. A shelf life is another question, actually. And I remember at the colour conference, quite a little debate going in the little group that I was on when we had the discussion session about how long do you keep them? Do you keep them in the fridge? Do they go off? What goes off? And I did go back and actually have a look at the technical information that comes along when you buy the dyes. And there are discussions about the shelf life of the dry powder and then about the shelf life of the made up solution. And when I was a student, I learned that I had to throw all my dyes away. But I think that was more the fact that there was only a small fridge. And so there may be a sort of rule that actually was never a rule, was just housekeeping. And those things I think we should be checking and revising and just renewing our knowledge of. It was interesting how many people in those discussions, myself included, were going, well, I don't really know.
Or, hey, well, we're always wanting students to do, we're always coming up with random questions that we think, the student project, do it.
Well, I can throw another couple in, and that's over-dyeing.
Ooh, yes.
Because sometimes I can buy a commercial fabric and have tested it that it's fast and it's suitable to use, but it's not quite the right shade. And occasionally we over-dye, particularly if we want to get dark shades, because it's very difficult to get a dark shade using the processes that we tend to use with our dyes. I'd like to know a little bit more to reassure myself that actually it does achieve the correct result. But how light fast are they? For example, am I accelerating the degradation of the fibre? Am I partially stripping out the dye as I'm trying to add a new dye at the same time? What exactly is happening? So that would be an area that I would encourage some students to look at.
Yeah, go for it, students. Answer all our questions, please.
So how about, are there any dye hacks that you can share with, everyone, obviously everyone who listens, but, especially those amongst us who might not have as much knowledge as you guys do about it?
I just follow the instructions, so I definitely don't have any hacks. I just have I will follow the rules. Yes, I will. Yes, thank you, and hopefully not make too many mistakes.
Well, I have a few hacks.
Yes, please.
So first of all, I think when it comes to color matching, with certain treatments such as overlays, where you are overlaying a semi-transparent material over the object, in order to give surface protection. Sometimes an exact match to the colour of the fabric that you are overlaying is not the best colour for the overlay. And I always encourage people to sort of expand their search for a suitable colour beyond the exact match to the object. Because sometimes it's something that's a little greener, a little greyer, a little yellower, that actually makes the overlay less visible and changes the color of the original object to the smallest amount, which are the two issues that you have with colored overlays. Think a bit more broadly in terms of color, particularly with overlays, but it also happens with putting a backing on as well. The second thing is about backings. If you just lay a large piece of fabric, such as your dyed sample, alongside your object, you will get a false impression about how well it matches within small holes. If you're trying to infill small holes, putting a great big piece of dyed sample alongside will not show how it looks in the little hole. So try to put it underneath and make your final decision based on how the fabric looks coming through the small holes. It doesn't work with a large hole, obviously. You might as well have the large piece next to the large hole. But for smaller holes or areas where there's maybe a warps or wefts missing and it's not completely a hole, you'll get a much more accurate assessment of the how well your colour matches if you put it behind the object and make your decision there. And then in terms of the technical side of things, certainly consider preparation, the sort of scouring of the fabric or hot washing or rinsing or ironing, all the various hints and tips about preparation that there are actually in the manual, because that may be the thing that is creating the problem of the dye taking up fully and taking up evenly. And also look at the sort of after processes. There are some after treatments that you can give that can improve the depth of the shade, the sort of intensity of the colour, and the fastness as well. So there could be things you do before and after that main dye process that actually really make the difference to the quality of your dye. one quite simple thing. When we have a lot of dye recipes, the easiest thing to do is to find a recipe and just follow it routinely. But if you have to modify it a little bit because it's not quite right, don't tweak what is already a tweak, or maybe a tweak of a tweak of a tweak from an original recipe that has been tweaked many times. And if you tweak it again, you lose track of exactly what is making the difference. It's far better to start with the pure colour as represented in the little booklet that you get from the suppliers that have the little samples of the pure colour. And then if that's not the right colour, then you choose the other colours that you're going to add in to adapt that original colour. Sometimes it's just so much better to go back to kind of first principles than be, tweaking what is already a repeatedly tweaked recipe, because you can't really understand what's made the difference.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Actually, the last bit of dyeing that I did was frustrating because I wasn't very happy or ended up not being particularly happy with the fabric that I used for my fill. And it ended up that both the fill fabric and the object looked very different in colour depending on the angle that you looked at it for. So I had to do, I can't remember how many, but there's about 8 different reds, I think. And I had to just lay them all out and walk around in circles around my object thinking, okay, which one is the least wrong in all the different situations? And then looking at them, they're identical reds.
Just to do with the lighting or the angle. I mean, certainly because we are mainly working on horizontal surfaces, but the objects, certainly the banners, and they are hanging up. So the orientation between the viewer and the object is going to be different. And we often climb up ladders to down over the object to colour match, particularly with overlays, because if you do come at them from an oblique angle, first of all, they look rather hazy and the colour just doesn't look right. But if you climb up, and look down from above, that really should be the kind of final check. Or you hang the object up at the end, or, pin it up and look at it that way. So there are just so many variables that come into play when it comes to colour matching. Surprising we get it right at all, really.
I know. So my colleague did an overlay on a painted surface on one of her projects, and it's a double-sided painted banner, so with a massive crack through the middle, so one side at least had to have an overlay. And I remain astonished at her colour match, because obviously it was a painting, there wasn't really one colour to match it to. It's just she managed to find this sort of misty grey colour that didn't seem to change anything at all. That was astonishing. I wish this was before I started though, so I just saw the results and thought, how did you get to this? That's amazing.
That is the magic, not the technical stuff. That is the magic, the choosing the colour. So she is the magician.
The Diversity of Dyes in History and Archaeology, edited by Joe Kirby, is a substantially academic 400-page collection of essays published by Archetype Publications in 2017. The essays cover a very broad range of topics and types of study, sorted into 5 different chapters. These are Approaches to the Study of Dyes, Dyes and Dyeing in Classical and Medieval Times, the 15th to the 17th Century, the 18th to the 19th Century and the Rise of Synthetic Dyes, and Properties, Chemistry and Analysis of Dyes. Naturally, my first thought is, hooray, a timeline! But the chapter layout isn't so much a timeline as a straightforward way of directing the reader's attention to topics of interest relevant to their work. I wouldn't call this a reference book, but a source book for the research of specific periods of dye use and for the research of previous dye studies. To start with reading this book, I had the impression that the topics jumped about jarringly within each chapter, which left me a bit confused as to the purpose of the book and how we were expected to use it as a professional resource. Given a bit more time, however, I realised that that's the whole point of Chapter 1, Approaches to the Studies of Dyes. We can learn so much from them that within a narrow range of the profession, jumping from the functions of colour in Polish folk attire to 3-deoxyanthocyanidins and their degradation products, seems pretty reasonable in the context of all the other topics covered by the book. Saying that, Chapter 1 is certainly more of an odd topics chapter than the following, as the following topics can be sorted into time periods, hence the title of the book, and the final one being simply science. The format of this is explained in the intro chapter, however, demonstrating the different ways that a dyed element of an object can be used to tell us about the object. And users of research collection publications are more likely to work from contents headings than start from the beginning of the book and then get confused. I do wonder if topics covered in this book could be missed by how broad they are, but I don't think that can be considered a fault of the book, rather just the division of the types of research in museums. I always say I love a timeline in these reviews, and though this travels in time, the case study essay nature of the book means that you get detailed snapshots of dye use rather than a complete picture. Because it's essay-based, though, it can be treated like a huge focused journal with the benefit of an abstract at the start of each chapter and a bibliography at the end of each chapter. Looking at one section as an example, the 18th and 19th centuries and the rise of synthetic dyes, it starts with the use of domestic dyeing lichens during the Age of Utility in Sweden, which details different discoveries and the individuals who made them, and includes details of processes and places the work in the historic social context of the time. The following chapter, Mr. Worth's Woolen Yarns, is particularly satisfying, using the techniques of XRF and Raman to identify the accuracy of samples and recipes, which, though the provenance is described with some mystery, could have significant relevance to many studies of Victorian wool dyeing in Europe. I've been pleased to see that colourant use has been broad as well, with printing inks in Sweden and England across 50 years, and later in the chapter, chemical principles of a doomed technology, azomethane colour photography, the use of old dyes and the development of colour photographs, and bright new colours, the history and analysis of fluorescein, eosine, erythrocene, rhodamine, and some of their derivatives, detailing the history and the use of these synthetic dyes in paints as well as textiles. In a way, I feel overwhelmed by the breadth of topics covered in this book, over all material types, all periods of history, and much of the world. But in the process of research, this is likely to be used alongside other sources, like Wikipedia, if a more complete picture of a certain time, place, object, or development was required. I've enjoyed looking through this book very much, and I can imagine it being of actual use to my work. I appreciate the science, obviously, but I also appreciate the collection and the summary of histories, so I don't feel blocked out of study and research by my inability to join in with it myself. The more I look through the content, though, the more I see that analysis is a strong theme throughout. Very positive, of course, and useful, but to me, this is useful as an indication of what I might find myself, rather than helping me with my own analysis, as well as any of the essays describing practical experiments with historic dyes, because I'm a sucker for this. I particularly liked the inclusion of historic and cultural context of object types and dye uses. Faced with FTIR figures, I'd rather just read the conclusions, to be honest, but surround them with objects and religious histories, and the results make a surprisingly rich view into colour, technology, manufacture, and innovation throughout history.
If you're enjoying the C Word and would like to support our work, then please consider becoming one of our patrons. For as little as $1 per month, you can help us keep our episodes online and more of them coming. Patreon helps us meet our regular costs for the show, and also to plan ahead so we know roughly how much of a monthly budget we've got. That's super helpful when you're trying to do something special like buy a better microphone or save up to go to a special event. Your support also helps keep us free of advertisement. In return, our supporters get access to our archive of extended episodes, which you can only access on our Patreon page. Yeah, for that $1 a month, you get a little extra audio enjoyment. We've crunched the numbers, and it's about 10% extra content on a regular basis. Well, that's not bad for less than a cup of coffee, eh? If supporting us sounds like something you'd like to do, then head over to patreon.com/thecword and join our bunch of absolute champions. And a warm welcome to our latest patron, Rebecca. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for listening. We're the C Word, and you've been listening to Alison Lister, Kloe Rumsey, and me, Jenny Mathiasson. Join us in the autumn for another season. In the meantime, check out our website at thecword.show, tweet us at thecwordpodcast, or simply email us on thecwordpodcast@gmail.com. The intro and outro music is Spring by Didi Missick, used under Creative Commons Attribution License. Additional music and sound effects by Callum Robertson. This has been a Wooden Dice production.